Imagine waking up one morning and the first thing you notice is that the lights won't turn on. You go to check your phone, but it's completely dead, and the usual buzz of the internet is nowhere to be found. Your TV doesn't work, the radio is silent, and you can't even find any connection to the outside world. No emails, no news updates, and no social media posts. It's a nightmare scenario that sounds almost impossible, but what if it actually happened? What if all of the world's electricity just shut off overnight? The truth is, we're so used to the constant hum of modern technology that we rarely stop to think about what would happen if it suddenly disappeared. The world runs on electricity. From the lights in our homes to the traffic lights on our streets, to the devices we use every day. Almost everything we rely on depends on electricity, and if it suddenly stopped, chaos would set in very quickly. In the first moments, it might seem like a temporary glitch, maybe a power surge or an unexpected outage that'll be fixed by morning, but as hours turn into the day, it will become clear that this isn't a simple issue. Imagine the panic that would spread as people realize that it's not just one neighborhood or one city or even one country. It's the whole world. Every single electrical grid has gone offline, and no one knows why or when it will come back. Now, the initial concern would be something simple. How do we stay warm or cool depending on where you live? Without power, heating systems and air conditioning would stop working, making homes uncomfortable or even dangerous. And that's just the beginning. Everything we use to stay connected, informed, or entertained is powered by electricity. Without it, we would be cut off from each other, left in the dark both literally and figuratively. Phones, radios, and the internet wouldn't work, and we wouldn't be able to access news or even communicate with people outside our immediate area. The world would feel as if it suddenly shrunk, leaving people isolated and vulnerable. The ripple effect of losing electricity would spread far beyond just our homes. Water treatment plants rely heavily on power to filter and pump water. Without it, millions would lose access to clean drinking water, putting communities at serious risk of disease and dehydration. Hospitals, emergency services, and other critical infrastructure would be crippled. No electricity means no functioning medical equipment, and no power for the staff that keep them running. Ambulances wouldn't be able to respond to calls, and first responders would be stretched thin with little to no resources at their disposal. Things would escalate fast. As hours pass without power, things would begin to take a more serious turn. The quiet panic that started to spread early on would grow into full-blown confusion and frustration. Without electricity, we'd begin to notice how much we truly depend on it for everyday life. For example, our food supply chains would be hit hard. Refrigeration and freezing are essential for keeping food from spoiling, but without power, food in grocery stores, warehouses, and homes would start to go bad quickly. What seemed like a temporary inconvenience could soon turn into a life-threatening situation as people scrambled to find ways to preserve food or secure fresh supplies. The transportation systems, which are vital to keep cities running, would also come to a halt. Without power, trains, subways, and buses wouldn't run. Traffic lights would stop working, turning major intersections into chaotic, potentially deadly gridlocks. Drivers would be forced to make their way through a maze of stalled vehicles and confusion. Air travel would be grounded as well, as airports depend on electricity to operate everything from check-in counters to the flight control systems. With the whole world's transportation network shut down, getting goods and people from one place to another would become almost impossible. Communities would start to notice the lack of communication. Without access to the internet or phones, people wouldn't be able to share information or coordinate with others. In larger cities, this could cause significant problems. Residents isolated from loved ones wouldn't know if their families were okay, and first responders would have no way to call for backup or relay crucial information. Those who had been planning to head out of town for vacation, business, or emergencies would find themselves stuck as no forms of travel or transportation were working. Plans and routines that relied on the steady flow of electricity would come to a halt, and life would quickly shift from what we know to a more primitive form of survival. Meanwhile, the simple conveniences that we once took for granted would be gone. No air conditioning on a hot day, no heaters in the middle of winter, and no ability to power essential devices like phones or laptops. People would be forced to rely on other means of communication like handwritten notes, while basic utilities like hot water would be out of reach. Over the next several days, many would struggle to adjust. As temperatures dropped or soared, depending on where you live, staying comfortable would become an increasing challenge. And while this might be uncomfortable for some, it would be far more dangerous for those with medical conditions that require electric-powered equipment, like ventilators. People who are already vulnerable in society, including the elderly and those with limited mobility, would be at risk of serious health issues or even death. As time stretched on without electricity, it would become clear that things would not return to normal anytime soon. In the first few days, people would hold on to hope, believing the outage was just temporary. But as that hope began to fade, the mood would turn darker. People might begin to panic or even resort to desperate measures as their access to food, water, and medicine dwindles. The systems that were put in place to keep societies functioning would start to collapse one by one. With no power to manage them, water treatment plants would stop working. Communication would be cut off, and hospitals would quickly become overwhelmed with patients unable to receive proper care. People would have to adapt, but the clock would be ticking and the sense of chaos would continue to build. As the days turn into weeks, the true consequences of a world without electricity would become even more apparent. The initial shock of the outage would give way to a harsher reality, one that would force people to adapt to a new, unfamiliar way of life. With no power, the conveniences we've grown so accustomed to, like the internet, television, and modern forms of entertainment, would vanish. People would have no choice but to go back to older forms of entertainment, like reading books, playing board games, or engaging in face-to-face conversations. However, with no electricity, the sense of isolation would grow stronger. People would struggle to find ways to pass the time, and in places where food supplies were running low, there would be fewer options for people to maintain their physical and mental health. Yet, during this time, one of the most significant challenges people would face is the lack of clean drinking water. Without power, water treatment plants would shut down, leaving millions of people without access to the clean water they rely on for survival. At first, people might try to use bottled water, but once stores run out, the situation would worsen. In many areas, people would have to resort to finding alternative water sources, such as rivers, lakes, or even rainwater, but this would carry its own set of risks. Contaminated water could lead to widespread illnesses, and access to clean water would quickly become one of the most sought-after resources. Communities would begin to organize to find safe ways to collect and distribute water, but it wouldn't take long before tensions started to rise, as the race for this essential resource grew more desperate. In major cities, the lack of power would bring more severe problems. People would still need to go to work, and businesses would still need to open. But without electricity, the usual systems for managing these operations would break down. Offices, stores, and factories would be forced to close, resulting in lost income and widespread economic turmoil. The global economy would grind to a halt, leaving people without the resources they rely on for daily life. The financial consequences would be devastating, and without power, it would be impossible to conduct business as usual. People would start to realize that this wasn't just a temporary inconvenience, but a shift in the very fabric of society. One of the most significant challenges people would face in a world without electricity would be the loss of medical services. Hospitals depend on power for life-saving equipment like ventilators, dialysis machines, and incubators. Without electricity, many of these essential services would be rendered useless, putting countless lives at risk. People who rely on electric-powered medical devices would find themselves in a critical situation. The healthcare system would be overwhelmed, and with no way to communicate with doctors or hospitals, many would have to rely on their own survival instincts to stay alive. The absence of power would also lead to an increase in medical emergencies, as people living with chronic conditions would be unable to get the treatment they need. As the weeks go by, some communities might start to come together to survive. People would share resources and rely on each other more heavily. It's likely that neighborhoods would bond in ways that we haven't seen in modern times, as people look out for each other and do what they can to make it through. However, as the days wear on, the lack of resources would create tension, food would become increasingly scarce, and the social order we take for granted would begin to erode. As desperation set in, some would resort to violence, looting, or taking extreme measures just to survive. Those with means or resources might try to leave for safer places, but the lack of transportation would make this nearly impossible. Communities would begin to form factions, and the social fabric that we've worked so hard to create would start to fray. With each passing day, the reality of life without electricity would force people to rethink what's truly important. Basic survival would take precedence, and long-term plans would be put on hold. People would focus on finding food, clean water, and shelter, and they would begin to understand just how fragile the systems we rely on are. But this situation would also lead to an opportunity for growth. As people adjusted to this new life, there would be a return to simpler times, a time when people relied on their resourcefulness and communities to survive. There would be a chance to rediscover skills and strengths that modern life has made us forget. But no matter how people adapted, the world would never be the same. The loss of electricity would be a reminder of just how dependent we've become on technology and how vulnerable we are when that technology disappears. As the months roll on, the situation in a world without electricity would become even more dire. By now, the novelty of a life disconnected from technology would wear off, and people would begin to realize the long-term implications of living in such a drastically altered world. Food supplies would continue to dwindle, and people would be forced to rely on whatever they could grow, hunt, or scavenge. This would lead to the rise of small, self-sustaining communities that would focus on agriculture, bartering, and survival skills. Some people might have learned how to grow their own crops, while others might have turned to hunting or fishing to make ends meet. But the reality is that without electricity, our agricultural systems would break down, making it harder and harder to produce enough food to sustain the population. The lack of electricity would also lead to an energy crisis, with people scrambling to find ways to generate power. Solar panels, wind turbines, and other renewable energy sources would become essential for survival, but not everyone would have access to them. Those who lived in rural areas or had the means to set up off-grid systems might have an advantage, but for most people, power generation would still be an issue. This would be especially challenging for those who live in urban areas, where the infrastructure is designed to rely on a constant flow of electricity. Urban centers without power would become ghost towns as people moved out in search of food, water, and a way to survive. As the world continued to adjust to the new normal, the breakdown of society would take a toll on mental health. People would struggle with the psychological effects of living in a world without the conveniences and comforts of modern life. Anxiety, depression, and despair would become more common, and without the ability to connect with others through technology, many would feel isolated and alone. People might try to organize in small groups for emotional support, but the constant stress of survival would wear people down. As time passed, the very essence of human civilization would change. Communities would become more insular, and the concept of trust would be redefined. In a world without electricity, every day would be a fight for survival, and it would take everything people had to keep going. At this point, the idea of restoring power would become a distant hope. People would still wonder if electricity would ever come back, but as the years dragged on, the chances of that happening would become slimmer. Governments and large organizations would struggle to get the systems back up and running, and the complexity of rebuilding power grids, communication systems, and infrastructure would be a massive undertaking. The financial and human resources required to restore everything would be nearly impossible to gather in the absence of a functioning economy. The global population would shrink and society would regress, reverting to simpler ways of life that rely on the most basic human skills: farming, hunting, and cooperation. But even in the face of such devastation, humans would find a way to adapt. Over time, society would rebuild itself from the ground up. The loss of electricity would force humanity to rediscover the importance of community, resourcefulness, and sustainability. The survivors of this new world would create new systems, new ways of living, and a new understanding of how to thrive without the technology that once defined their lives. But it would be a hard road ahead, one where every day would require a reminder of how much we took for granted in the world we once knew. It would be a world in which the need for electricity is no longer a convenience but a distant memory, a world where survival would take precedence and the lessons learned from this global catastrophe would change humanity forever. And in that future, the question would still linger: would we be able to build a better world from the ashes of the old one? Or would we fall back into the same patterns of over-reliance on technology, forgetting the lessons of the blackout that nearly destroyed civilization? One thing is certain: the world without electricity would forever change the way we see the world and the way we live in it. The story of this new world would be one of resilience, struggle, and the enduring human spirit. It would be a world where survival is the only thing that matters and where humanity would learn the true meaning of self-sufficiency.